world expects, I believe, China and the United States to play key roles in addressing global challenges from climate changes to food insecurity, and for us to be able to work together.
President Biden meeting with China's leader for the first time as president, putting climate change front and center. Joining me now, KT McFarland, former Deputy National Security Advisor, author of the book, Revolution Trump, Washington, We the People. KT, good to see you. I want to start with the climate change. China is using climate change against the United States to make us more dependent on the communist nation and to bankrupt us. Michael Schellenberger has written about this at length, KT. Just what is Biden doing?
Well, Biden is talking about climate change, climate change, climate change. What are the Chinese talking about? They're saying, oh yeah, really serious topic. We'll get to it in about the year 2060. Meanwhile, we're building one coal power plant a week, and we're also the guys who are manufacturing all the component parts to renewable energy, solar, wind, etc. So of course the Chinese are talking about a good game about let's all deal with climate change, but they're not doing anything. And as you point out, we are enriching China. We are going to spend American dollars on the Green New Deal to buy Chinese products. Meanwhile, we have abundant, cheap, clean American oil, natural gas, and what are we doing? President Biden has a war on American fossil fuels.
You mentioned that. So the $370 billion of taxpayer money that's subsidizing solar panels and wind turbines in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, those are made in China. And Michael Schellenberger wrote this: wind, solar, and batteries require 1,000% more steel, concrete, and glass, 4,200% more lithium, 2,500% more graphite, 1,900% more nickel than fossil fuels to produce the same amount of energy. And worst of all, China's market for these renewables and EV minerals is already twice that of OPEC's share of oil. This is burdensome to the United States. We're ceding power and prosperity to a communist nation that Joe Biden can't even call out on the origins of COVID and fentanyl. Again, more than 1 million Americans are dead because of COVID. He says nothing based on the readout.
Yeah. And here's the thing. I mean, look, this meeting was going to amount to nothing anyway, because the Chinese are going to say our core demand is we are going to have Taiwan however we want it, whenever we want it, whatever way we want it. There's nothing you can do about it. And Joe Biden will say climate change, climate change, climate change. Meanwhile, the United States could be in such a dominant position with regard to China. Right now, we don't have a lot of leverage. We don't have a military that we've invested in compared to the Chinese, but we could be so competitive with China, and we could be in such a different position if we would only get rid of this war on American fossil fuels. As you point out, the climate change agenda by Biden, that's not helping the climate, that's not helping greenhouse gas emissions, that's helping China. And at the same time, we're handicapping our own economy for some, chasing after this unicorn that is never going to happen.
I brought up that he apparently didn't mention, it didn't come up in the press conference, the origins of COVID or fentanyl, but also talk about, KT, that and the body language between these two leaders.
The body language was, it was game over by the first couple of minutes of their meeting. So Xi Jinping is standing there at the meeting. He's there first. Biden has to walk across the stage as if he's the supplicant to shake Xi Jinping's hand. So now we look at that and we say, what does that matter? It doesn't matter at all. Everybody in Asia sees that picture of Joe Biden having to be the supplicant walking across the stage. Xi Jinping standing there as if he's the head guy there, and the rest of the world, and Asia particularly, they look at that and say, oh, I guess the Chinese are right. America is a declining power. The President of the United States has to come seeking favors from the Chinese president. China is a rising power and the dominant power of the 21st century. So game over after the first handshake, frankly.
KT, talk about, you mentioned this, Xi Jinping reiterated China's red line, that they will unify with Taiwan. Talk about Biden's response to that and where we stand.
All right, well, there's nothing new on this red line. When the Chinese officials met with me during the Trump transition, they talk about this is our core interest, this is the one thing that matters to us, is reunification and taking over Taiwan. And we've always said, well, you know, we believe in one China, but we're very vague and ambiguous about how that's going to happen. And then we follow up by saying we don't want to have this done in a military fashion. The difference between now and 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, is even the Pentagon war gamers say if it ever came to a war between the United States and China over Taiwan, the United States loses. So all of a sudden, Xi Jinping is putting down his demands about China, and he is the guy who's in charge of the outcome of this. Biden, because of America's weak economy, because of our ceding the sort of international stage on these moral issues like COVID, like fentanyl, and frankly, by letting the American military, particularly the Navy, atrophy, we're not in the position to enforce much of anything anymore. So, of course, the Bidens, he thinks he's had a terrific meeting. It was a great photo opportunity. But the reality of it is that the Chinese leader, now newly elected as emperor for life, looks like he is going to be the dominant power, and China will reset the rules of order. And the United States, well, you're a declining world power. You just take what you get.
Compare Biden, though, before we go, to what, say, a Ronald Reagan would have said.
All right, I worked for Ronald Reagan, and Dagan, the first thing Reagan did at any meeting with the Soviet leader is he would sit there and he would start talking about political prisoners, and he would talk about the people who were, the Russian people who were held in these prison camps. We knew the Soviet Union was not going to do anything about it. We knew we couldn't do anything about it. But the point is you get that on the piece of paper and you say, look, the world hasn't forgotten, we haven't forgotten. By Joe Biden not talking about fentanyl, by not talking about COVID, he's basically saying to the Chinese, you guys got away with it.
And he's the message to the grieving families of the more than 1 million people who died from COVID, the hundreds of thousands of people who've died from fentanyl poisoning. The message is, I don't care. KT, thank you.
The message is, I'm going to chain this climate change myth as fast as I can, and too bad for you.
KT, thank you so much. Great to see you, KT McFarland.
Thanks, Dagan. Good to see you.